All right, kid. You choose wrong, you're dead.
Please let me go.
Only if you answer correctly.
What?
Bourbon or Scotch?
What about it?
Bourbon or Scotch? Which is better?
Well, I don't know. Can I at least watch the Thirsty Oaks video before deciding?
Yeah, not a problem.
Bourbon or Scotch? What is the difference? And most importantly, which one is better? I'm Thirsty Oak. Let's talk about it. Apart from bourbon being made exclusively in America and Scotch being made exclusively in Scotland, the two can be broken down into 3 steps of production. And each of those steps they do completely different. Each of these steps plays an important role in the product's character and taste. And no 2 distilleries do all these the same. So let's start with the first step, and that is mash. Is what the bourbon guys call it, or wort, what the Scotch guys call it. It is the same thing. So let's start with bourbon. So bourbon has to be made up of at least 51% corn. Now, as long as it's made up of 51% corn, the rest of it can be any other grain. The most common are going to be wheat or rye. The corn is known for adding that bourbon sweetness, where the wheat and rye are known for adding the seasoning. Now, additional to that, there is typically a little bit of malted barley, and that is actually just to be able to break down those starches in the mashing process. Now, if the majority of the mash bill is made up of any other grain, it becomes that type of whiskey. So for example, if it's 51% rye, it is now a rye whiskey. If it is 51% wheat, it is now a wheated whiskey. Now as for Scotch, the mash, or as they call it, the wort, can be made up of any grain. That's it, any grain of their choosing, and they can bottle it as Scotch. However, Scotch is not all over the place. In fact, the majority of Scotch is going to be 100% malted barley. Now, while 100% malted barley is not required, most distilleries do it just because barley is particularly easy to grow in Scotland, and that's just how they've historically done it. Now, malted barley is known for adding that honey sweetness you find in Scotland. Now, once the mash, or the wort, has fermented, it's time to distill. Now, bourbon and Scotch also do this differently. Now, bourbon is known for using continuous column or coffee stills. There's basically 3 different names and it's the same thing. This process is essentially a stack of stills with one heat source from the bottom, steam. The main advantage of this process is it's extremely efficient and you can continuously distill the whiskey. After just one run, you can end up with an extremely high proof spirit as well. Now, there are some Scotch distilleries that do the same distilling process, but for the most part, you're gonna find pot stills in Scotch. The main difference in a pot still is it's gonna be one batched run. So they're gonna distill the entire wort and then clean it out and refill it. Now, because after one run, the spirit is not high proof enough, there's typically 2 to 3 distillations that occur before they have their final distillate. Now, since this is not nearly as efficient as the column stills, they compensate by just making the pot stills bigger. So if you've ever been to Scotch distilleries, there are typically these massive stills that are so beautiful and big, and it's kind of a statement piece. That's just because it's so inefficient, so they just had to make them so much bigger to make the same amount of whiskey. Now that the bourbon and the Scotch have been distilled, it is time to age. Bourbon is legally required to be barreled in new charred oak barrels. Now, there is no time requirement in the aging process to be called bourbon. It could literally be put in a new charred oak barrel for 5 minutes, taken out, and called bourbon. However, there are subcategories. If you ever see straight bourbon, it means that it's been aged for at least 2 years. If you ever see bottled and bond, it means that it's been aged for at least 4 years. Bottled and bond also requires the spirit to be bottled exactly at 100 proof. Now, if bourbon is aged longer than this, it's typically standard to put the age statement on the bottle because it's typically a great selling point. As for Scotch, it has to be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years to be called Scotch. Now, with that being said, the barrels do not have to be new. They can be any type of barrel. So typically Scotch is going to be a lot of ex-bourbon barrels or ex-sherry barrels. The bourbon enthusiasts like to say they took all the good flavor out of the barrel, where the Scotch guys like to say the bourbon guys took all the harshness out of the barrel. Well, now you are well versed in the production differences between bourbon and Scotch, but what tastes better? Hey, babe? Babe? Hey, babe? All right. So to figure out what tastes better, bourbon or Scotch, I brought my unsuspecting wife to do a blind tasting with me. Well, it's blind for her, it's not very blind for me. So first we're gonna start with the right glass.
It's pretty smooth.
Pretty smooth. We got it pretty smooth on whiskey 1.
It's a little sweeter than the other one.
Smell sweeter?
Yeah.
Okay.
like that one more.
You like that one more?
I don't know, not as spicy.
Sweeter. Okay, not as spicy.
Yeah.
So whiskey number 2 is sweeter and not as spicy. Well, whiskey number 2 is gonna be the bourbon. All right, folks, so you heard it first. So somebody who never drinks whiskey, except for when I kind of forced it on her, prefers the bourbon over the Scotch. Now, personally, I gravitate towards both of these on different times. If I want something that punches a little bit more flavor and has that really nice sweetness, then I'm typically going for the bourbon. Now, if I'm going for something that I want to sit down, maybe think about, and it's a lot more light and delicate, and there's some really floral notes and honey sweetness, then I'll typically go for the Scotch. But both are amazing in their own regard, and I highly recommend that you try them both to figure out what you like the best. Well, it's been great having you guys. Please like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you know anytime the Thirsty Oak posts a new video. It was great having you guys here, and cheers.